So with that, let's get to it. Chris, the floor is yours.
Jordan, thank you so much. And I appreciate the opportunity to be able to present this paper. So my paper's title is The Mannishness of Man and the Imago Dei, an analysis of Francis Schaeffer's anthropology and apologetic methodology. Much has been made in recent years of Francis Schaeffer's apologetic approach, especially in light of his theological influences. While questions persist as to the framework of his methodology, Schaeffer's apologetic continues to influence and intrigue. Many have sought to place Schaeffer in a variety of different apologetic categories. To note, those who evaluate apologetic approaches have often focused on one's cognitive faculties and epistemology. These various taxonomies include theological and philosophical discussions about the noetic effects of sin on the human mind and how optimistic or pessimistic one should be about the capabilities of human reason. While these discourses are important to have, if one focuses only on mental capacities, the discussion will inevitably be reductionistic towards the whole human person. Instead, one should embrace a holistic view of man, grounded in a theological anthropology, demonstrated in both the theory and practice of apologetics. While this approach can be done in a variety of apologetic methodologies, Francis Schaeffer's approach is persuasive in its nearly imitable focus on the human person. Schaeffer was well known for his care and compassion of people, which was ultimately rooted in his biblical theological conviction. Therefore, in this paper, I want to argue that Francis Schaeffer's understanding and conception of theological anthropology has direct implications for his apologetic methodology. To begin, one first needs to understand how Schaeffer is identified within various methodological taxonomies. By observing various categorizations, one can understand the prevalent assumptions about Schaeffer's work and method. Second, one should understand Schaeffer's theological and educational influences as they relate to his apologetic methodology. These influences are often articulated in terms of his former teachers and will help lay context for analyzing Schaeffer's theological anthropology. Third, and notably, one must analyze Schaeffer's work to develop a consensus opinion on his understanding of the image of God and the nature of humanity, and thus develop his theological anthropology. Lastly, one can synthesize these components to understand how Schaeffer's anthropology affected his apologetic approach overall. Many have written on Schaeffer's apologetic methodology, seeking to place him in a definitive category. Interestingly, Schaeffer often avoided such questions himself, which only leads to further speculation. One author argued Schaeffer was an empiricist or a classical methodologist. Others have argued for a presuppositional approach. Even others have argued for a method focused on verification. Brian Morley more recently places Schaeffer in a combinationalist category with E.J. Carnell and Gordon Lewis. As stated, Schaeffer himself was reluctant to subscribe to a formal methodology. He said, quote, "I'm only interested in apologetic that leads in two directions. And the one is to lead people to Christ as Savior, and the other is that after they are Christians, for them to realize the Lordship of Christ in the whole of life. I don't believe there is any one apologetic that meets all the needs," end quote. Elsewhere, he responded to a student's question about his methodology, asserting, quote, "I am neither. I'm not an evidentialist or a presuppositionalist. You're trying to press me into the category of a theological apologist, which I'm really not. I'm not an academic, scholastic apologist. My interest is in evangelism," end quote. This evasion was Schaeffer's general approach when pressed on the question. However, while Schaeffer was regularly hesitant to place an apologetic label on himself, he did seem to see the benefit in certain approaches. He states in his book, The God Who Is There, that presuppositional apologetics would have stopped the decay of Western culture, writing, quote, "It was indeed unfortunate that our Christian thinkers did not teach and preach with a clear grasp of presuppositions that could have helped young people to face their difficulties. The really foolish thing is that even now, years after the shift is complete, many Christians still do not know what is happening. And this is because they're still not being taught the importance of thinking in terms of presuppositions, especially concerning truth," end quote. Yet he elaborates in the appendix of the same book, and he says this, he says, quote, "I do not believe there is any one apologetic which meets the needs of all people," end quote. Schaeffer was uneasy about subscribing to a mechanistic apologetic formula that misses the person with whom one is interacting. That is, he seemed to understand overly formulaic approaches to be insensitive to people in their individual contexts. This consistent tension between various methodologies is arguably most on display in Schaeffer's A Review of a Review, in which he addresses two of his former teachers and their methods, both Van Til's presuppositionalism and Buswell's classical approach. In the article, Schaeffer notes the commonalities between the two prominent apologists that they shared in their methodologies. Further, after pointing out various similarities, Schaeffer then suggests an answer to their differences from an anthropological perspective. The first 2 points of Schaeffer's answer begin with and include a focus on the unsaved man. A similar sentiment is stated in Lane Dennis's assessment of Schaeffer's evangelistic methodology, in which he argues that Schaeffer begins by exploring a person's human experience and how individuals personally account for ultimate meaning, love, and personality. Undoubtedly, Schaeffer had an eye on epistemology when thinking about defending the faith. So much so, Schaeffer quipped, quote, "Unless our epistemology is right, everything else is going to be wrong," end quote. Much of his more explicit apologetic and philosophical works are geared toward an epistemic framework. For that reason, many have rightly analyzed and critiqued Schaeffer on these grounds. Yet, an analysis that only evaluates Schaeffer's epistemology fails to take into account Schaeffer's larger anthropological framework. Many have observed Schaeffer's apologetics from the acquisition of truth. Few have sought to understand Schaeffer primarily from his theological understanding and conception of humanity. Before offering a consensus of Schaeffer's anthropology, though, it is worth surveying his apologetic and theological influences. Schaeffer began his theological education in the midst of the liberal fundamentalist debate, and under the influence of his wife, enrolled at Westminster Theological Seminary, where he studied under both J. Gresham Machen and Cornelius Van Til. Though he was certainly affected by his context within fundamentalism, early on in his career, Schaeffer challenged the caricatures of this movement. He unashamedly held to the fundamentals of the faith, at length defending their viability within the Christian worldview. At the same time, Schaeffer stood staunchly against the anti-intellectualism that was quickly becoming part and parcel of the fundamentalist movement. Instead, he gave attention to the history of ideas and how various ideologies have interacted with Christianity in diverse ways. Because of this, Schaeffer seemed to have a unique ability to balance orthodoxy and orthopraxy in his approach. He thought critically and biblically about the world, but was also compelled to a faith-informed action. Arguably, a catalyst for this holistic worldview was his understanding of humankind. Regarding Schaeffer's apologetic, theological, and educational influences, there are a few figures that rank high on the list. Without a doubt, Van Til had an influence on Schaeffer during his studies at Westminster. The question, though, is what amount of influence did Van Til exert on the young apologist evangelist? Schaeffer studied under Van Til for 2 years at Westminster and kept in contact with his former professor after his time there. While some have made much of their correspondence, it seems Schaeffer was hesitant to engage Van Til explicitly regarding their respective approaches to apologetics. As time went on, the disagreement between the two men only seemed to grow. Nevertheless, William Edgar notes a strong similarity between Schaeffer's, quote, "taking the roof off," his approach, and Van Til's, quote, "ripping off the iron mask," in their processes of challenging false presuppositions. As Van Til interacted with Schaeffer, there was certainly a level of agreement as to what being made in the image of God meant for humanity in connection to his presuppositions. In 1937, Schaeffer followed J. Oliver Buswell and Carl McIntyre as they formed Faith Seminary, a breakoff from Westminster, in connection with a new denomination, the Bible Presbyterian Church. Buswell, a more classical evidentialist, exerted some influence on Schaeffer. Indeed, Schaeffer makes use of evidence throughout his apologetic works, instead of exclusively applying a transcendental argument or a argumentum ad absurdum to opposing worldviews. While Schaeffer certainly garnered much under Buswell and McIntyre, he would eventually question the lack of love in this new movement. As Edgar writes, quote, "Schaeffer remained concerned throughout his life with the purity of the visible church, but felt that his colleagues lacked reality, one of his favorite concepts," end quote. Schaeffer again was seeking to balance orthodoxy and orthopraxy in his own life. Worth noting is Schaeffer's relative similarity to E.J. Carnell. While the two did not publicly engage with one another's ministries, both studied under Van Til and made shifts in their personal approaches from their former teacher. We know Schaeffer was familiar with Carnell's work, at least his Introduction to Christian Apologetics. While Carnell certainly had a more analytical and systematic approach, both weighed the importance of man's existential crisis, as well as dealt honestly with man's presuppositions. Both engaged with presuppositions, but opened those presuppositions up to verification. They were both utilizing the evidentialist method of B.B. Warfield and the presuppositionalist method of Van Til. In more Van Tillian terms, Robert Raymond states, quote, with Carnell, Schaeffer invites the non-believer to judge Christianity with an apostate epistemology, end quote. Schaeffer and Carnell shared an approach that engaged with the presuppositions of a person while avoiding the more extreme notions of their former professor. As Brian Follis argues, quote, the evidentialist apologetics of those influenced by the old Princetonian approach and the presuppositionalism of Van Til provided Schaeffer with a rich intellectual heritage. In his own apologetics, there are elements of both traditions, end quote. While this approach finds itself in a more moderate methodological position and seems to describe Schaeffer's approach well, it is noteworthy that Schaeffer logically begins with presuppositions. Nevertheless, Schaeffer utilized presuppositional and evidential classical methodologies, so much so that Clark Pinnock argued Schaeffer flowed, quote, back and forth between these two very different standpoints as suits him, end quote. To be clear, Schaeffer's subscription to a formal methodology is not what made his approach so compelling. After establishing his various influences, our attention is now turned towards Francis Schaeffer's theological anthropology. Schaeffer wrote on a variety of subjects in his more than 20 books, including epistemology, art, culture, theology, and even Bible commentary. That said, his views are not always consistent across all his works. Therefore, much of what is offered here is an attempted synthesis of his writings found across his literary corpus. To be clear, whether his apologetics logically began with an anthropology or not, he understood Christianity as a system that begins with a few basic truths, which include, quote, the existence of the infinite personal God, man's creation in his image, and a space-time fall, end quote. He often referred back to the inherent nature of man, human personality, sin's effect on mankind, man's responsibility in the universe. He believed a theological anthropology to be fundamental to the Christian message. While Schaeffer spoke at length about the nature of man, it may be helpful to address his framework according to particular components and terms. At the center of Schaeffer's anthropological understanding is what he calls the, quote, mannishness of man. By this term, Schaeffer generally means the personality of man. He writes, quote, man has a mannishness. You find it wherever you find man, not only in the men who live today, but in the artifacts of history, end quote. By mannishness, Schaeffer does not offer a negative descriptor, but instead doubles down on man's true humanity. This mannishness is something man can never escape because it is inherent in his nature. This quality is the touchstone for man's experience with reality. Schaeffer writes, quote, it is true that man has touched something, not nothing, but what he has touched is not God, but the objective reality and the mannishness of man that God has created, end quote. He speaks here of man's created nature placed there by his creator. Schaeffer understands this mannishness to be intentional and not the product of blind mechanistic chance. He speaks of this expression in relation to Romans 1 and the appeal to human experience that is manifested in man. Further, it is this truth of man's inherent nature that is so crucial in demonstrating the truth of the Christian faith. The existence of this inherent nature is the reason Schaeffer argues man is able to do certain things even though he's affected by sin. He posits that man is still able to love, still able to make things that are beautiful. He writes, quote, it is because they can still do these things that they manifest that they are God's image bearers, or to put another way, they assert their unique mannishness as men, end quote. Further, this mannishness includes a longing for significance, love, beauty, and much more. This longing culminates throughout Schaeffer's work as a longing for meaning. Man's inherent nature is described in the mannishness of man is the internal truth that is then related to the form and existence of the external universe. He often reminded his readers that all of reality is connected. It is this conjunction of internal and external that he uses so well to demonstrate man's existential longings and subsequent satisfaction. The personal nature of man, the personal beginning of the universe, and a personal God all walk hand in hand in Schaeffer's theology and worldview. Connecting all of these aspects together in Schaeffer's concern for the metaphysical, focusing on the nature of being both in God and in mankind. All of life for Schaeffer is personal. While he generally uses the term consistently, at times Schaeffer can convolute the mannishness of man. He is largely referring specifically to the inherent internal aspects of man. However, at least once he explicitly states that the mannishness of man is simply what it means to be made in the image of God. Moreover, at times when using the term, it seems Schaeffer can be referring to longings beyond man, rather than certain inherent characteristics. In the end, though, when Schaeffer refers to man's mannishness, he is appealing to his readers to recognize what it means to be fully and completely a human person. Connected to this term of mannishness is the biblical phrase, the image of God. The image of God plays a significant role in Schaeffer's understanding, not only theoretically, but also practically. Jerram Barrs writes, quote, "The conviction that all human persons are the image of God was not simply a theoretical, theological affirmation for him, nor was it just a wonderful truth to be used in apologetic discussion," end quote. Since Schaeffer makes references to various elements that may be included in the image of God, it may be best to understand Schaeffer's anthropology as an integrated approach, utilizing and combining various components. When writing specifically on the image of God, he generally places a high emphasis on two functions, rationality and relationship. These two capacities serve his apologetic arguments well. However, he does include other facets as well, including dominion. He argues for the inclusion of these elements not on man's ability, but rather because of man's role as a creature reflecting attributes of his creator. To be clear, these components should not be understood as strictly functional. William Edgar argues that, quote, "It is clear from his statements that the image of God is constitutional more than functional," end quote. Edgar argues that for Schaeffer, the image of God is summed up in four attributes within man: morality, rationality, creativity, and love. In other places, Schaeffer includes in this list significance as well. For Schaeffer, these attributes seem to be part of man's design. These are attributes placed within man as creatures made by his creator. They are part of what it means to be human. So while Schaeffer never writes systematically on the issue, these attributes seem to be grounded in man's constitution. Some of Schaeffer's clearest formulations on the image of God are found in his book, Genesis in Space and Time. He writes, quote, "What differentiates Adam and Eve from the rest of creation is that they were created in the image of God," end quote. Schaeffer couches this language of distinction in contrast to naturalistic understandings of man, a common dichotomy found throughout his writings. Instead of a more mechanistic beginning, Schaeffer argues that the Christian knows who he is, having a right understanding of his origin. Here, Schaeffer implies that the image of God manifests itself in the possibility of fellowship and personality. He states, quote, "Because I am made in the image of God, and because God is personal, both a personal relationship with God and the concept of fellowship has validity," end quote. He also argues that the image of God makes communication possible, and that God can reveal propositional truth to those who are made in his image. He writes elsewhere, quote, "I am made in the image of God. This being so, I am rational and I am moral. Thus there will be a conscious and a responsible behavior," end quote. Clearly, much is included in Schaeffer's understanding of the Imago Dei. However, these comments concerning fellowship, personality, and communication are somewhat peripheral in his commentary on the image in Genesis in Space and Time. Instead, Schaeffer places an emphasis in this volume on man's role in exercising dominion. He states, quote, "Dominion itself is an aspect of the image of God in the sense that man, being created in the image of God, stands between God and all which God chose to put under man," end quote. Schaeffer picks this theme up in a later work, calling this practice of dominion mankind's lordship over all creation, drawing a connection to Christ's lordship for the redeemed believer. Even by implication, this understanding of man being engaged in the cultural mandate is seen throughout Schaeffer's work, not least of which in his writings on art and cultural engagement. He argues elsewhere that to be made in the image of God, quote, "means he can make moral choices. Also, man is rational. This means he can think. It also means that man is creative. We find that men everywhere make works of art. It is also the reason man loves," end quote. For Schaeffer, the image of God contains man's personality, in which man has freedom and ability to influence history. He understands man to be a causal agent, able to influence the course of history with the choices set before him. Schaeffer states that even though man is a sinner, before any redemptive work of Christ is applied to him, he still has the ability to do tremendous works and is not subject to the wheels of determinism. Thus, while Schaeffer is certainly faithful to his Presbyterian and Calvinistic theology, he does not seem to subscribe to some form of meticulous providence or fatalistic determinism. Instead, his understanding of man is more akin to Anthony Hoekma's term of a created person. Man is both dependent upon his creator and responsible for his own actions. Thus, Schaeffer's understanding of the image of God is manifold. He does not seem concerned with an overly systematic approach here, and thus does not analyze the congruency between these various attributes. For Schaeffer, though, all of the various components of the image of God are rooted in man's personal nature, which is designed by a personal God, and has the potential to live in harmony with a personal universe. In other words, man was designed for harmony, both internally and externally. While Schaeffer had a strong focus on the image of God, he had an equally robust understanding of the effects of sin on man. As was his practice, Schaeffer gave this theological concept his own term, the dilemma of man. However, John Voss indicates that there is some confusion here, stating, quote, there is a certain amount of ambiguity in Schaeffer's use of the term dilemma of man. But it is essentially this: man has moral motions, yet he consistently fails to meet the expectations of his own standards. The shortfall between man's nobility or morality and his cruelty and immorality is man's dilemma, end quote. To put in more theological words, man's dilemma is the existential tension he experiences that is rooted in objective, true reality due to his sinful actions. He also refers to this tension and consequence as, quote, man's abnormality. The subject of man's sinfulness and dilemma is present in much of Schaeffer's apologetic argumentation. He states, quote, Christianity says man is now abnormal. He is separated from his creator, who is his only sufficient reference point, not by a metaphysical limitation, but by true moral guilt. As a result, he is now also separated from himself. Therefore, when he is involved in cruelty, he is not being true to what he was initially created to be. Cruelty is a symptom of abnormality, and as a result of a moral historic space-time fall, end quote. This abnormality of man is not intrinsic to the mannishness of man. If his abnormality was intrinsic, then man would have always been this way, and there would be no hope for a solution. For Schaeffer, man's sinfulness maintains two prevalent themes. One, true moral guilt before God, and two, separation of man's fundamental relationships. First, Schaeffer often stressed the importance of understanding man's true moral guilt, not just a mere psychological guilt. Schaeffer challenges the notion that man simply has guilty feelings without standing truly and legally guilty for his sin. Of course, man's true guilt manifests itself in real psychological guilt, but his moral standing precedes his emotions. Man's abnormality is not simply metaphysical finiteness or psychological conviction, but a real moral legal problem which requires an actual solution. Schaeffer himself writes, quote, because man is guilty before the lawgiver of the universe, doing what is contrary to his character, his sin is significant, and his is morally significant in a significant history. Man has true moral guilt, end quote. Man, then, is a fundamentally moral creature made in the image of his creator. Second, Schaeffer often conceptualized man's sinfulness as separation. Schaeffer listed 4 different relational divisions that take place because of man's sin. First and foremost was man's separation from God by his sinful actions, which results in his true moral guilt. From this separation comes all other divided relationships and leads to repercussions for the rest of reality. Second, man is separated from himself. This division is the reason for man's psychological problems, which includes his psychosis and self-deception. In this category, consisting of man's internal separation, Schaeffer not only includes epistemological implications, but also sexual and physical effects as well. Third, man is separated from fellow man, which leads to sociological problems. Interestingly enough, here, Schaeffer discusses the existence of 2 humanities, a godly or redeemed humanity and an ungodly, unredeemed humanity. Those who have been redeemed can experience the restoration of the division and live within a new, restored community. Lastly, man experiences separation from nature itself. Here, man has lost his full dominion, and now nature often rules over him. Schaeffer writes, quote, the simple fact is that in wanting to be what man as a creature could not be, man lost what he could be. In every area and relationship, men have lost what finite man could be in his proper place, end quote. Contrary to a more reductionistic understanding of man's sin, Schaeffer understood man's sin to have a personal, psychological, sexual, physical, sociological, and even ecological implications, all because of the primary division between God and man due to the fall. In contrast to other views, Schaeffer argues that humanity still retains something of the image of God after the fall. He argues that the fall does not affect man's unique distinction from other things in creation. Further, he contends that man retains the mannishness of man after the fall. He still retains the image of God, though it is, quote, twisted, broken, and abnormal, end quote. He also comments on Romans 1:23, asserting that by sinning, man who is made in the image in God's image is now making God in his own image. He did not believe the effect of sin to be some kind of philosophical abstraction. Instead of just an existential lostness or hopelessness, he articulates man as a rebel against his creator with real moral guilt and responsibility. Schaeffer understood sin to have real consequences in space and time. Schaeffer is clear that the solution to man's dilemma does not come from man, it comes from God. The solution rests upon Christ, the God-man, who through his death on the cross in space and time rectifies man's true moral guilt with the infinite value of Christ's life. He understands participating in the Christian life as a regenerate believer to be a restoration of what one was meant to be. That to be a Christian is to live out the intended purpose of an image bearer. Christians experience something similar to the original order of creation, though now under a different covenant and dependent on Christ's mediatorial work. Moreover, Schaeffer understood that the finished work of Christ to not only bring healing to man's true moral guilt, but to bring healing to all four of those fundamental relationships. That is, Christ's work will bring, quote, healing which will be perfect in every aspect when Christ comes again in the history in the future, end quote. He understands our justification to be immediate upon regeneration, and all other healing to be taking place and be fully realized in the eschaton. Summarizing much of Schaeffer's thought on the topic, his son-in-law, Udo Mittelman, writes, quote, only in the Bible is the human person addressed, valued, and respected as a thinking, responsible individual. Here are the roots for a genuine humanism, i.e., a concern for the human being who, having been made in the image of God, is now fallen and in need of God's reliable information about all of life and redemption. This includes an explanation of the mandate for man to live, work, and create. Only in the Bible do we have enough information to know that the world is no longer what God meant it to be. We now live after the fall of man. God is not found in every aspect of history. We live by his word, not by what we find in nature. Neither earth nor nature is our model. They also are in need of redemption, end quote. Schaeffer understood the redemptive work on the cross to have multiple implications for Christian living. While the focal point is on Christ's work, Schaeffer understood it to be the responsibility of redeemed humanity to partake in restorative work. Schaeffer believed that much of this healing work is done through the visible and transformational work of the church, the new humanity. While not excessive, Schaeffer does mention man's constitution in his work. In agreement with much of the historic Christian church, he states that God made man both body and soul, and that redemption reaches the whole of man. Interestingly, it is in his short work, Art in the Bible, Schaeffer discusses this element of anthropology. Schaeffer bases much of his discussion on the importance of art for the Christian on the fact that God made the whole of man, and that when God saves the whole of man, Christ is Lord over the whole of his life. God created the whole of man, and therefore God is interested in just that, his work of dominion, his ability to communicate, his love, his fellowship, his influence on history, and much more. Schaeffer pushes against theological reductionism that may understand man as merely a soul to be saved. Man is both body and soul, and Christ's work and lordship extends to both parts. In light of Constitution, Schaeffer argues that man's redemptive relationship with God is the only thing that can integrate the whole of the human person. He states, quote, it has got to be the whole of man coming to know this truth, acting upon it, living it out in his life, and worshiping God, end quote. The application of the gospel in Schaeffer's understanding was comprehensive for the entirety of man and the whole of reality. Much of his ministry was focused on the reconciling nature of the gospel and how the good news brought peace both relationally, spiritually, and existentially to the human person. In synthesizing Schaeffer's view, there are two related elements that highlight the internal-external dynamic. For one, man's significance, and two, man's responsibility. Man is the pinnacle of God's creation, reflecting in his own personality a personal God who is there. Yet man is also culpable for his actions and maintains real moral guilt before God for his sin. The interplay between these two elements is a fundamental theme throughout Schaeffer's apologetics. Schaeffer, like much of the Christian tradition, understands man to be both the greatest creative work of God and also the agent of the historical fall. This tension certainly speaks to the existential crisis Schaeffer often addresses. He writes about the universality of this crisis, stating, quote, "Thus, when you face a 20th century man, whether he is brilliant or an ordinary man on the street, a man in the university or the docks, you are facing a man in tension. And it is this tension which works on your behalf as you speak to him," end quote. While each person is unique, they share a universal problem. Man, then, is designed to pursue his fundamental goal, which applies to the entirety of his life. This purpose has in scope a holistic view of humanity. Schaeffer, clarifying man's purpose in the world, writes, quote, "The Bible speaks of the purpose of our creation when it says to love God with all our heart and soul and mind. Yet this must be understood in the scriptural framework. It is not to love God in the concept of a Kierkegaardian leap. It is not to love God as though faith were something in itself. The answer, according to the Bible, is not a faith in faith, but a faith in the one who is there, and therefore it is a living relationship with him. It is to love God with all our heart and soul and mind, and definitely in the biblical sense," end quote. Thus, for Schaeffer, the end goal of man is to fulfill the greatest commandment. Just as scripture commands, this is a love that includes our thoughts, affections, and will. This understanding of purpose, much like the rest of his anthropology, is not particularly unique, though he writes about these themes in a compelling manner. Across the different aspects of anthropology, Schaeffer does not depart from a historic, fundamental view of Christian theology. While his views are not always systematic, Schaeffer holds to a fundamental and theologically orthodox understanding of mankind. That said, few apologists seem to spend as much time on the image of God and man's inherent nature as Schaeffer does. He wrote with a particular concern for his fellow man. Thus, it is not Schaeffer's theology that is unique in and of itself. Instead, what may be particularly unique is Schaeffer's faithfulness to apply this theological anthropology and his genuine love for people. As demonstrated, Schaeffer has a thoroughly orthodox anthropology found throughout his writings. In Schaeffer's various apologetic arguments, whether they be metaphysical, epistemological, or moral, he places man's personality as a central component to his thinking. When a new issue would present itself in culture, Schaeffer's main concern was often the place of the human being in that discussion. The question then is how Schaeffer's anthropology was brought to bear in his approach to apologetics. That is, how did his theology affect his methodology? One author posits the answer clearly, quote, "His entire apologetic method was driven by compassion for every person whom he saw as created in the image of God," end quote. As stated earlier, much is made of Schaeffer's epistemology and his connection to Van Til, Buswell, Carnell, and others. Yet these assessments too often offer a limited view of Schaeffer's apologetic. In light of his thoroughly biblical anthropology, Schaeffer has a multi-layered approach that is both scripturally faithful and culturally compelling. In conceptualizing Schaeffer's person-sensitive approach, it may be helpful to think about two major components that are interrelated and complementary. Schaeffer's anthropologically informed methodology can be assessed by his one, argumentation, and two, his ministerial and personal practice. First, while Schaeffer certainly avoided any formulaic approach to his own apologetic, he did write about apologetics in a variety of capacities. Recalling the article from earlier discussing the differences between Buswell and Van Til, Schaeffer's first point of agreement between the two apologists is that, quote, "both sides agree that the unregenerate man cannot be argued into heaven apart from the sovereign call of God," end quote. Additionally, he concludes the article arguing, quote, "we should never forget either that none of us will be completely consistent until we are fully glorified," end quote. Schaeffer offered to his two former teachers a methodology with a theological focus, or at least emphasis, on man. His unifying approach began with man's situatedness in the universe. While Schaeffer certainly had an epistemological emphasis in his apologetic, specifically seen in his trilogy, this epistemic conflict was not dealt with in the abstract. Instead, Schaeffer argued that man senses this divided field of knowledge, even at an existential and psychological level. Whether or not Schaeffer better fits into a presuppositional or evidential school is still unclear. What is clear is that Schaeffer sought common ground with the skeptics and doubters with whom he interacted. He understood knowledge to be prior to salvation. It is to be the whole person that understands the truth of the gospel. Therefore, for the apologist to rightly engage in this kind of apologetic, he or she must be committed to the rationality of the gospel. As Schaeffer held to a strong belief in rationality of Scripture and man's need to embrace its truth holistically, he also conceptualizes apologetic methodology with an understanding of each individual man's situatedness. Following Schaeffer's approach, one should seek to understand a person's thought forms and worldviews in order to communicate them clearly. According to Schaeffer, each person comes to the gospel within their own unique context, feeling the weight of man's universal dilemma. As Colin Duryea mentioned, Schaeffer's approach, quote, was shaped in context and hence was person-centered, end quote. Each man is unique, and yet all of mankind shares the same inescapable questions of life. Schaeffer saw his anthropology being grounded in the special revelation of God. Rooting this demonstration of love for all people in the authority of scriptures, Schaeffer writes, quote, "We who stand for the word of God as without mistake, not only when it speaks of salvation matters, but also when it speaks of the cosmos, history, and moral norms, must be careful to live under the word we say to hold so clear. And that very much includes love to those, many of whom are certainly brothers and sisters in Christ, who we think are making a dreadful and destructive mistake in their view of the Bible," end quote. He staunchly believed that if one is to hold to the truth and veracity of Scripture, then that truth has immediate and sustaining implications for the Christian life, not least of which includes demonstrations of love towards other believers. Schaeffer realized if the Christian's faith were to be compelling, then Christians would have to live consistently with their stated beliefs. Additionally, if the scriptures were true, then it meant Christ's lordship extended to all of man's person and work. Further, Schaeffer understood his entire schema within the conceptual framework of a personal God and a personal universe. Personality is central to Schaeffer's entire approach. He understood the answer to all of man's longings and ultimately the solution to man's dilemma to be found within, quote, personal infinite God and a personal unity and diversity in God. Christianity has this in the Trinity, end quote. A personal universe with a personal beginning from a personal God is the foundation for morality, epistemology, and metaphysics. Again, this is not an apologetic approach in concept only. Ultimately, this is the foundation upon which Schaeffer built his Christian worldview. Schaeffer demonstrates his intellectual approach in his writings, especially in his trilogy, yet it bears repeating that Schaeffer never explicitly laid out his own apologetic approach. While he gives enough in his writings for future apologists to emulate, it may be better to understand Schaeffer's approach more in terms of how he did apologetics rather than what he has said about apologetics. That is, to rightly understand Schaeffer's apologetics, it is crucial to see how he operated his ministry throughout his life. This leads to the second element of Schaeffer's apologetic method, his practice. Schaeffer demonstrated his methodology in consistent habit throughout his life. Jerram Barrs articulates the synthesis as well, stating, quote, "The truth that we are the image of God, a truth that is at the heart of all of his apologetic work, was for Schaeffer a reason to worship God. This conviction of the innate dignity of all human beings had many consequences for Schaeffer. He believed and he practiced that belief that there are no little people," end quote. This commitment was demonstrated practically through his ministry and throughout his lifetime. He invited people into his home, consistently emphasizing and exemplifying grace-filled community. One of Schaeffer's greatest legacies is his establishment of the L'Abri community. Schaeffer avoided the sin of partiality, understanding the image of God in man, understand that the image of God in man was a reason to respect and dignify all people of every background. The negative effects of not capturing this biblical vision for mankind were also on Schaeffer's mind as well. Adam Johnson writes that, according to Schaeffer, quote, "When human beings are reduced to mechanics of physics and chemistry, the person, as well as all personal significance, disappears," end quote. This flattening of the human person led to a dehumanization with far-reaching implications. Schaeffer had a particular concern regarding the naturalistic worldview. He was concerned with the worldview of an impersonal and mechanistic universe that sees the world only in terms of utility. He believed rightly, it seems, that there would be myriad implications for man and his place in the universe if all was framed only in terms of matter and chance. Schaeffer held a beautiful, dynamic understanding of man, even in light of man's sinfulness and moral guilt. To him, naturalism flattened man's significance and purpose. Follis clarifies that while Schaeffer's approach was not person-centered, it was person-sensitive. He consistently kept his theological focus upon God, his work, and the reality of God's existence. However, Schaeffer sought to make sure that that the human person was taken into account when engaging apologetically. His final apologetic is a perfect example of this concern. This final apologetic is rooted in John 17:21 and is demonstrated in the visible unity of the church, which necessarily includes sacrificial, Christ-like love. This final apologetic was not a hypothetical concept Schaeffer posited, but a practice he embodied. At the center of his work was L'Abri, and L'Abri was, quote, grace extended at L'Abri was grace extended to everyone. It was not a formless grace, but one structured by the intellectual and biblical teaching that pervaded, end quote. This final apologetic is mentioned throughout Schaeffer's corpus and is fleshed out in his book, The Mark of the Christian. Echoing the sentiments of 1 Corinthians 13, Schaeffer argued that apologetics is useless if it is not driven by love, specifically a love for God and fellow man. Further, this is to be demonstrated in tangible ways, exhibited in substantial individual and corporate healing. Schaeffer sought to demonstrate love and unity to all made in the image of God. Schaeffer realized that being relational was a fundamental part of man, especially for Christians. Thus, his theology implicated his methodology in a communal way as well. He placed a relational emphasis on his work at L'Abri. Schaeffer, understanding man as a relational creature, sought to emphasize and practice the collective longings inherent in man. He not only understood this to be emblematic of what it meant to be a Christian, but also understood redeemed community to offer restorative work at a societal level. One should recognize that Schaeffer's concern for the human person extended beyond his explicitly apologetic enterprises. Even when Schaeffer was not seeking to share the gospel with the unbeliever, his anthropology had practical implications. Consistently, he was engaging the broader culture on a variety of issues. He prophetically spoke on a variety of issues that are still in discussion today: euthanasia, abortion, pollution, and his books like Whatever Happened to the Human Race, A Christian Manifesto, and Pollution and the Death of Man all speak to these issues. These issues were rooted in Schaeffer's theological anthropology, many of them directly tied to man's four basic relationships. Schaeffer was not only concerned with easier cultural issues, given his cultural environment. Relatively unique within his more fundamentalist context, Schaeffer engaged in a level of racial reconciliation that was rooted in his theological anthropology. His wife Edith records that during segregation, Schaeffer consistently sought to meet and fellowship with African Americans. Likewise, Schaeffer continually met with an older African American man who had worked as a janitor at the Schaeffer's college. He would visit this man up until his death, reading the Bible and praying with him. Similarly, Jerome Barrs observed how the Schaeffers welcomed people of all races into their home at L'Abri, and how Schaeffer performed marriages for interracial couples, even to the dismay of his critics. In his writings, he points out the atrocities of the slave trade and the need for social action that is grounded in the base of Christian faith and willing to stand against social injustices. A biblical theological anthropology was key to Schaeffer's practice and certainly contributes to his continued relevance. Put succinctly, quote, mankind as significant being, created in the image of God, stood out in Schaeffer's theology. It is the Christian message of meaning and love and the clarifying biblical worldview that Francis Schaeffer stressed, which makes his apologetics so relevant in the 21st century, end quote. Schaeffer's anthropology is interwoven throughout his apologetic arguments in a variety of ways. Further, his anthropology necessarily led him to a certain social action. Suffice to say, on the topic of the image of God, Schaeffer lived consistently with his stated beliefs. While Francis Schaeffer was admittedly not an academic and saw himself more of an evangelist than apologist, he remarkably leaves behind a rich legacy concerning a theological vision for apologetic practice. Schaeffer's views on anthropology are well within the confines of orthodoxy, and much represent the confessional traditions to which he subscribed. In no demonstrable way does Schaeffer depart from the historic Christian understanding of man, whether in regards to the image of God or the effects of the fall. Instead, Schaeffer utilized a thoroughly biblical theological anthropology in both his argumentation and practice. While he did not hold to overly unique views on the nature of man, Schaeffer is distinctive in the way in which he rightly manifested those beliefs into compelling argumentation and action. Because of this consistency, Schaeffer has influenced numerous apologists, philosophers, and Christians at large. Yet these are not just influences that offer lip service to this man. Charles Colson, Os Guinness, Nancy Percy, and many others count Schaeffer as the primary influence on their theological and apologetic thinking. Further, L'Abri communities across the world continue to thrive. The Francis Schaeffer Institute at Covenant Theological Seminary, Francis Schaeffer Foundation in Switzerland, and the Schaeffer Collection at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary all proclaim the lasting influence of this man. Yet one may inquire as to the uniqueness of his approach. The uniqueness, as it were, is found in the harmony between what he taught and what he lived. In his writings, he clearly held the image of God in high regard. However, that belief affected both his written arguments and his ministerial personal practice. He was simply focusing on the mannishness of man and bringing true truth to bear in the reality in which man lives. Simply, Francis Schaeffer sought to see man as God sees him, and to respect the inherent dignity found in the image of God.